In a world where law and crime clash like a game of chess, the moment of sentencing is the decisive moment. It is when the court falls silent, all eyes turn to the defendant, and the judge's words define a destiny. Imagine being there, facing a life sentence, knowing that your freedom has been taken away forever. How does a drug dealer, who built his empire in the shadows and lived for violence and power, react to hearing that he will never leave prison? In this video, we will follow the reactions of some of the most feared drug dealers when they are sentenced to life imprisonment and even the terrible death penalty. The first case is that of Antonio Francisco Bonfim Lopez, better known as Nem da Rocinha, was one of the most powerful and feared drug dealers in Brazil. He led the drug trafficking in Rocinha, the largest favela in Rio de Janeiro, and for years controlled not only the drug trade, but also the daily life of the community. Nem's influence went beyond drug trafficking. He was seen by many as a protector, but he was also feared for his violence and the absolute control he exercised. This story, however, began to change in 2011, when his capture marked a turning point in the fight against drug trafficking in Rio de Janeiro. The operation that resulted in Nem's arrest took place on an almost cinematic night. It was around midnight, and police were conducting checkpoints on the entrances to Rocinha, which was surrounded as part of an operation to regain control of the favela. During the stops, a black Toyota Corolla was coming down the hill, apparently with 3 men on board. When they were stopped, the occupants of the car identified themselves as authority figures. One said he was a consul from Congo, another an employee of the consulate, and a third a lawyer. But their suspicious behavior drew attention. When the police asked to open the trunk, the men refused and claimed that they would only do so at the federal police headquarters. At that point, they tried to bribe the officers. First, they offered 30,000 Brazilian reals, but when that didn't work, they increased their offer to 1 million Brazilian reals. Even when faced with a tempting offer, the police officers didn't give in. They opened the trunk and discovered Nem da Rocinha, hiding and offering no resistance. Rio de Janeiro's most wanted drug trafficker was finally in custody. Nem's arrest was treated as a historic milestone. The convoy that took him to the federal police headquarters in the port zone was greeted with a honking of police cars and celebrations from the police officers. Wearing a blue shirt and black pants, Nem was surrounded by officers as he was removed from the police van. That moment symbolized the end of the reign of one of the country's biggest drug traffickers. What came next was the trial, which put Nem in the spotlight. He faced serious charges, including drug trafficking, homicide and criminal association. In court, prosecutors presented evidence detailing his leadership in the drug trade, the structure he ran and the crimes that had been committed under his orders. Witnesses reported how Nem maintained absolute control of Rocinha, resorting to bribes to ensure his protection and resorting to violence against anyone who challenged his authority. Even in the face of such serious charges, Nem maintained the same demeanor he had displayed at the time of his arrest, calm, almost indifferent. During the court sessions, he showed no emotion, not even when prosecutors spoke about the homicides for which he was accused. His coldness caught the attention of everyone present, including the victims' families. It was as if he were oblivious to the gravity of his actions. In his defense, Nem alleged that there were irregularities in the trial and that his defense had not been given access to crucial documents. He stated that he felt wronged and that he had not been given a fair hearing. Despite these allegations, prosecutors emphasized that Nem's crimes were unquestionable. They presented accounts and evidence of his connection to homicides and his role in drug trafficking, highlighting the complexity and scope of his criminal organization. When the verdict was finally announced, the conviction came as no surprise. Nem was sentenced to 96 years in prison, one of the highest sentences given to drug trafficking leaders in Brazil. His reaction, however, drew attention. Nem listened to the sentence without showing any emotion. He lowered his head for a moment, but showed no regret or surprise. For many, this attitude was a reflection of his personality, a man accustomed to power and the consequences of his actions. After his conviction, Nem was transferred to the federal prison in Porto Velho, Rondônia, as part of a strategy to distance him from Rocinha and reduce his influence in the favela. Even from inside prison, his name continued to circulate. In 2018, he gave an interview stating that he no longer wanted anything to do with drug trafficking. "I want to be with my children, go to the beach, to the theater, enjoy life away from crime," he said. Despite these statements, the public and the authorities still doubt his intentions. The arrest and conviction of Nem da Rocinha were seen as a victory in the fight against drug trafficking, but they also showed the limits of this fight. After his departure from Rocinha, new leaders took control, and violence continued to be a reality for residents. Nem's story is an example of the impact of drug trafficking in Brazil and the challenges faced by authorities in combating organized crime. Today, Nem from Rocinha continues to serve his sentence, and his behavior in court remains an example of how major drug traffickers face justice, with coldness and indifference, even in the face of such severe sentences. Before we continue with the video, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any shocking stories. Here, we share moving stories about criminals who made history, and you won't want to miss out. Click the subscribe button now and join us on this journey. We really appreciate you following us. Another case is that of Pedro Espinosa, a member of the violent 18th Street Gang, who was sentenced to death for a brutal murder linked to gang rivalry. Espinosa, born in 1989, was not just another gang member. He was part of a group that not only terrorized communities with extreme violence, but also profited from illegal activities, including drug trafficking. The 18th Street Gang, also known as Barrio 18, is one of the largest and most violent transnational gangs. They are involved in a wide range of crimes, such as extortion, smuggling and, most importantly, drug trafficking. Espinosa, as an active member, operated within this criminal context. Police records showed that he had previously been arrested in 2007 for illegal possession of a weapon and assault on a police officer, which indicated his active role in gang activity. At the time, authorities believed that he was armed to protect gang territory or to carry out orders related to drug trafficking. Espinosa's presence in drug trafficking was not isolated. 18th Street used its members to control the distribution of drugs in urban areas and ensure that their territories were not invaded by rival gangs, such as the Bloods, who were also deeply involved in drug trafficking. This environment of rivalry and violence culminated in the crime that brought Espinosa to court. On March 2, 2008, just one day after being released from prison, Pedro Espinosa committed the crime that would mark his life. He and another gang member got out of a white car and confronted Jamil Andre Shaw, a 17-year-old who was walking home from a day at the Beverly Center. The reason for the confrontation? Jamil was carrying a red Spider-Man backpack, and Espinosa associated the color with the rival Bloods gang, mistakenly believing Jamil to be one of them. Jamil, who had no gang affiliation, was confused and did not answer Espinosa's questions. Without hesitation, Espinosa pulled out a gun and shot the young man, killing him just a few feet from his home. Jamil's father, who was at home, heard the gunshots and ran out into the street, where he found his son seriously injured. Jamil was taken to the hospital, but did not survive. Espinosa was arrested shortly afterward. During the trial, Jamil's murder was portrayed as an act of brutality motivated by the culture of violence promoted by the 18th Street Gang. The prosecution stressed that the crime was not an isolated act, but part of a wider network of criminal activities by the gang, which included controlling drug trafficking in several communities. Although Jamil's murder was the central crime, it was directly linked to the lifestyle Espinosa led as a member of the gang, a world where protecting territory and eliminating rivals was part of everyday life. In court, Espinosa's demeanor was described as cold and impassive. Even when the evidence against him was presented, including witness statements and ballistics evidence, he showed no remorse. The prosecution argued that this lack of emotion was a direct reflection of the gang's mentality, where showing weakness was unacceptable. After 4 years of legal proceedings, Pedro Espinosa was sentenced to death on May 23, 2012. The judge declared that Jamil Shaw's murder was a senseless act of violence, committed to further the activities of the 18th Street Gang and reinforce its position of power. The case of Pedro Espinosa not only exposed the extreme violence associated with gangs, but also highlighted how these organizations use drug trafficking to fund their activities and control entire communities. Although Jamil's murder was the crime that landed Espinosa on death row, his involvement in drug trafficking and gang culture were instrumental in shaping the environment that culminated in his tragic end. Now let's look at the case of Chris Young, a young man who, at the age of 21, heard his death sentence and saw his life change forever. Chris Young grew up in a difficult environment, marked by extreme poverty in the absence of a solid family structure. His mother struggled with substance addiction, which left Chris and his siblings often without water or electricity in the house. The greatest tragedy came when he lost his older brother, a blow that led him to seek refuge in crime. During his adolescence, Chris joined gangs and began dealing drugs, accumulating petty crimes that already put him in conflict with the law. But it was in 2004 that his life changed irreversibly. Under the influence of drugs and alcohol, Chris entered a store in Texas with the intention of committing a robbery. During the robbery, he ended up shooting and killing the store owner, Hasmukh Patel, a respected member of the local community. The murder was recorded on security cameras, and Chris was quickly arrested. There was no doubt about his guilt. Chris's trial was one of the most defining moments of his life. In court, he listened to witnesses and lawyers argue about his fate. The defense tried to present a more human side, highlighting the circumstances of his upbringing and the remorse he felt. However, the prosecution focused on the gravity of the crime and the devastating impact it had had on Hasmukh Patel's family. When the judge announced the death sentence, Chris reacted silently. He hung his head, as if the weight of the decision was unbearable. Those present described the moment as intense and tense. It felt like time stood still, one witness said. Chris later spoke about how he felt when he heard those words. At that moment, I knew my life was over. Not just because of the sentence, but because of all the harm I had caused. Everything I had done wrong seemed to fall on me all at once. It was a weight I will never forget. After being sent to death row, Chris began to reflect deeply on his life and his choices. He did not try to deny his guilt, instead, he spent the next few years repeatedly expressing his remorse. He got involved in activities inside the prison to try to make a difference. Chris stopped fights between inmates, saved an inmate from committing suicide, and helped ease racial tensions in an already hostile environment. Even so, he knew that these actions would not change the past or erase the pain he had caused. Hasmukh Patel's son, Mitch Patel, did something surprising. He started a campaign to seek clemency for Chris. Mitch believed that Chris had changed and that his remorse was genuine. He argued that execution would not bring his father back and that Chris could have a chance to redeem himself by helping others. I lost my father, but I believe Chris understands what he did. He is not the same man anymore, Mitch said in interviews. His emotional defense brought a human side to the case, but it was not enough to change Chris's fate. Chris's lawyers also filed lawsuits, claiming that the decision to deny clemency was rooted in racial bias. They compared the case to others in which white defendants, even those found guilty of similar crimes, had their death sentences commuted to life in prison. Despite their arguments, the parole board upheld the sentence. On the day of his execution, Chris made a final statement. He said that his time on death row had in some ways saved his life. This is where I learned to value life. Before that, I didn't know what it meant. I never had the chance to explain to my daughters what life was, but I hope they see that even with my mistakes, I tried to change. His story is a painful example of the impact of bad choices and their irreversible consequences. In court, the moment a defendant hears his sentence is often transformative, revealing the weight of decisions and the brutality of justice. For Chris Young, this moment was the point at which his life became a reflection of what could have been, but never was. In this case, the person did not receive life imprisonment or the death penalty, but watch until the end to understand why this case is here. Until the 1980s, 70% of the cocaine that entered the United States passed through South Florida, transforming Miami from a tropical paradise into a veritable war zone. With homicide rates tripling in a wave of shootings in broad daylight, the city was engulfed in chaos. At the center of this storm was Griselda Blanco, a woman who, at just 5 feet tall, commanded one of the most powerful and feared empires in drug trafficking. Known as the Godmother of drugs, she was one of the most influential and ruthless leaders of the Medellin cartel. Griselda was not just a drug trafficker. She was a strategist who knew how to command respect and fear. During the 1970s and 1980s, her network moved millions of dollars a month, and her reputation was built on relentless violence. To protect her business, Griselda was linked to hundreds of murders, many of them personally ordered. These crimes ranged from public executions to brutal acts that spared even children. Her story led her to a Miami court in 1985, after being captured in California. Prosecutors were determined to show the world who Griselda Blanco really was. During the trial, they detailed her crimes, including 3 specific murders that brought her to justice. Among them was the case of two former associates who dared to challenge her and ended up being killed on Griselda's orders. The third case was even more shocking, the murder of a 2-year-old child, killed in an attempt to target his father, a rival of Griselda's. In court, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence. Witnesses described how Griselda carefully planned her attacks, using tactics to send a message of power and eliminate any threat. One of the methods she popularized was the use of motorcycle assassins, a strategy that would become synonymous with her brand of terror. These accounts painted a dark picture of the woman who controlled an empire of drugs and violence. Even in the face of these serious accusations, Griselda Blanco maintained the same demeanor she had at the height of her power. She sat in court with a disturbing calm, as if oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Not even the emotional testimonies of the victims' families seemed to shake her expression. Witnesses present described her as cold and calculating, reinforcing her reputation for being ruthless and remorseless. When the time came for the verdict, Griselda surprised everyone by pleading guilty to 3 murders. The plea deal came as a shock. Despite her involvement in hundreds of deaths and being considered one of the most dangerous criminals of her time, she was sentenced to serve only 10 years in prison. This sentence sparked outrage, especially among those who had hoped for a harsher punishment. After serving her sentence, Griselda was deported to Colombia in 2004. She disappeared from the spotlight for a while, but the legacy of violence she left in the United States continued to resonate. Her story came to an ironic end in 2012, when she was shot dead by 2 motorcyclists in Medellin, a tactic she herself had used throughout her criminal career. The Miami courtroom was the stage where justice finally caught up with Griselda Blanco, even though many considered the punishment insufficient. Her crimes, however, have not been forgotten. Griselda continues to be remembered as an example of the brutality and devastating impact of drug trafficking. Despite her downfall, she left a trail of blood and power that still haunts the criminal world. Today, you witnessed moments in which drug traffickers face the weight of their choices before the courts, moments in which power, built outside the law, is dismantled under the relentless light of the court. These stories show us that behind every sentence, there are lives affected, crimes that leave deep scars in a legal system trying to restore balance. If this content has sparked your curiosity, made you reflect or brought you new perspectives, be sure to show your support. Click the like button, tell us your opinion in the comments and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the next stories we will bring. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing real, complex and remarkable stories. We thank you for following us until the end of this journey and we count on you in the episodes to come.